Racist cop. Drags black woman. Out of court, then freezes when she flashes her FBI badge. There are courtrooms where no verdict is needed to determine who wins or loses, because the moment someone walks into the room, justice itself is put to the test. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Located in the heart of Fulton County, one of the most conservative judicial districts in the state of Georgia, Courtroom 4, A bore a coldness that matched the rulings once handed down there. Ash-gray brick walls, old dark wooden furniture, and flickering fluorescent lights cast an uneasy glow over the rows of benches, illuminating every furrowed brow and anxious glance of those present. Time seemed to slow inside this space, giving way to solemnity and the weight of unchallenged traditions. In the last row, a black woman quietly took a seat. No one noticed where she entered from, only that her presence cracked the wall of silence like a fault line. The red blazer she wore was so vivid, it felt almost out of place among the sea of gray, brown, and black suits around her. Her hair was neatly tied, her collar perfectly aligned, every seam of her outfit tailored to precise symmetry. She didn't speak, didn't move unnecessarily, didn't even glance at anyone, as if she were part of the room itself, not a visitor in it. Her posture made others around her subconsciously straighten their shoulders, sit up straighter, and adjust their arms. Her right wrist rested gently on her knee, her left hand loosely clasped, eyes cold and steady, scanning the direction of the defendant's podium, where a criminal hearing involving a district official was about to take place. But no one in the room knew she hadn't come to observe that trial at all. A middle-aged woman in the row ahead turned slightly to look back, her eyes meeting the stranger's for a brief second, before she turned away, as though she'd seen something she wasn't meant to see. Polished appearances often brought comfort, but in this woman, perfection radiated a quiet dominance, making others around her feel as if they didn't quite belong. The air grew heavier as the door on the right swung open. Officer Burney entered, nearly 6 feet 3 inches, broad-shouldered, his uniform stretched tightly across his frame, adorned with badges, a sidearm holstered at the hip, and a radio crackling faintly. But it was his footsteps that chilled the room, like the gate of a prison guard, not a servant of justice. Burney offered no greetings. He didn't need to. With over 14 years of service at Fulton County Court, Burney was well aware of the invisible authority his uniform commanded. He'd once been praised for decisive action and had de-escalated intense hearings in mere minutes through sheer psychological pressure. To him, justice wasn't in the ruling, it was in the order. And whoever disrupted that order would pay, regardless of whether they were right or wrong. His gaze swept quickly across the courtroom. To the left, a cluster of lawyers murmured in hushed tones. To the right, 2 defendants sat uncuffed, staring intently at the table. Everyone was in their place. But when his eyes reached the back row, where a crimson silhouette sat quietly amidst shades of gray, Burney stopped. She was still seated. She didn't rise, and she didn't bother to look at him. The silence in the room didn't break, but it began to hum. Those nearby, though unaware of what was happening, sensed that some unspoken rule had just been torn apart. Someone looked down at their phone. Another laced their fingers to restrain themselves from interfering. No one spoke, but no one felt at ease anymore. Inside Burney's mind, a familiar command echoed. Disruption of order. Must be corrected immediately. And for him, that was never a judge's call. He began to move toward her, and though the red blazer had not budged an inch, it had already become the epicenter of an impending quake, whose tremors no one in that room could yet comprehend. Burney didn't need anyone to signal him. He was far too accustomed to defining order on his terms, and any gesture that deviated from that mold was automatically added to his mental list of troublemakers needing correction. To Bernie, the uniform was an absolute power card, and his footsteps in every courtroom were no different than a blade slicing through defiance. He began moving slowly down the aisles, eyes scanning without missing a single movement. Some people lowered their heads even further. Others subtly shifted as if avoiding a draft. That was the usual effect whenever Bernie entered a room. But this morning, something was different. In the back row sat the same woman in the red blazer. She hadn't moved, hadn't glanced his way, hadn't even arched a brow as he passed, as though his presence bore no weight at all. For Bernie, this wasn't just strange. It was a blatant insult. He stopped right next to her. The room slipped into a near-perfect stillness. Only the faint hum of the air conditioner and the soft scratch of pen on paper could be heard. "I didn't see you stand," Bernie said, his voice low with a metallic rasp at the end, like metal scraping wood. She tilted her head slowly, as if responding to a comment about the weather. Her reply came not quickly, but with the certainty of a nail driven deep. "Because I saw no reason to stand." No raised voice, no bitterness, no insult. But it was precisely that calm, nearly indifferent composure that made Bernie feel as if he'd just been slapped, in the very room where he was used to being the only force capable of silencing others. People usually reacted to Bernie's attention with confusion, fear, or rushed justifications. But this woman did none of that. She didn't apologize, didn't stammer, didn't explain. She simply sat, as if power didn't come from a weapon, but from having a solid reason not to bow. Bernie clenched his jaw. His gaze swept the room, a deliberate move. He wanted the audience to see. He wanted everyone to know who had just violated the unspoken code. This wasn't merely about restoring order. It was a ritual of intimidation, one he'd repeated hundreds of times on anyone who dared step off the invisible line he'd drawn. Without warning, Bernie leaned down and gripped her left wrist with his thick, calloused hand. The silence was shattered. A woman in the third row dropped her pen. A court clerk froze mid-sentence. A sharp intake of breath came from the courtroom's far right, but no one dared speak. The woman was pulled to her feet. But curiously, she didn't flinch, didn't resist, and most notably, didn't stagger. She stood upright, as if she'd been lifted not by a brutal hand, but by the natural necessity of shifting a scene. Their eyes locked. Bernie, with the familiar look of a man used to dominating. But this time, he didn't receive submission, nor guilt, nor fear. Instead, the woman looked at him as if examining a specimen under a microscope. Calm, penetrating, cold enough to drop the room's temperature several degrees. There was no provocation in her gaze, no challenge, only a quiet question ringing out. "Do you know what you're doing? And do you truly think you matter here?" Bernie felt exposed, as if every heartbeat, every pattern of control he'd relied on for over a decade was being dissected in plain view. And in that very silence, she wasn't defending herself. She was opening the door for truth to enter. She didn't need to claim the right to speak. She only required to stand and not to fall. And for an officer like Bernie, that was unacceptable. But it was also something he could neither explain nor control, not with power, not with experience, not with command. Silence, but the kind that could shatter at any moment, like a sheet of thin glass pressed against a smoldering flame. Bernie continued gripping her wrist with deliberate force. The tendons in his forearm stood out, his jaw tightened, and his eyes blazed. He no longer saw himself confronting a defiant woman. He saw a threat to the entire order he had built on unquestioned authority. "I said, show your ID," Bernie growled, each word grinding through clenched teeth like a whetstone. There was no reaction. She didn't flinch, didn't resist. Her right hand, the one still free, began to move. No rush, no panic. Every motion seemed rehearsed for high-stress scenarios, like a silent choreography, programmed precisely for this moment. Her hand slipped into the edge of her blazer and pulled out a small object, a matte black leather wallet. No patterns, no logos, no brands. And yet the entire room seemed to freeze the moment she opened it. There was no click, no soundtrack. But someone, unclear from which row, let out a quiet gasp as if short of breath. Under the harsh, cold fluorescent light, a small rectangular piece of metal reflected silver directly into Bernie's eyes. On it, the embossed seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Beside it, a portrait and a stern line of text. Audrey Rowe, Senior Investigator, Internal Oversight Division. A direct blow to the core of every assumption Bernie had walked in with. In less than 10 seconds, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Wooden benches, once merely functional, suddenly creaked with unease. Pins froze mid-stroke. A recorder stopped spinning as a clerk dropped it onto the desk. No one needed to be told to stay silent. They already had. Corbin, the security officer stationed at the back, had just lifted a foot to step forward, but halted midway. He'd seen Bernie halt a lawyer for stepping just 10 centimeters over a red line. He'd seen the man yell into a defendant's face for simply glancing up at the wrong time. But this time, Corbin understood something had gone deeply, irreversibly wrong, and there was no turning back. Bernie still hadn't let go. His hand remained clamped around her wrist, now clearly reddened from the pressure. But his eyes were blinking rapidly. His palms were damp. He stared at the badge as if it were something that shouldn't exist in his reality, something meant to stay in federal briefings or national headlines, not drop into a Monday morning civil hearing. Audrey said nothing. She didn't need to. What she had just done was not a declaration of power. It was proof that true power doesn't need to speak. That small silver badge, cold and metallic, carried no weapon, no handcuffs, but it made the guns and cuffs of abusers meaningless. Someone pulled out their phone, not to make a call, but to record quietly. Not from curiosity, but from an instinct that whispered, "This is the moment justice truly enters." Not from the judge's bench, but from the last row of seats. A woman, not angry, not struggling, merely standing tall and opening her wallet, had thrown the whole system into disarray. And the man still gripping her wrist, the one so sure he commanded every gaze in the room, was now the epicenter of a collapse no one could stop. Bernie tried to keep his face composed, but his eyes betrayed the tremble. Inside his mind, the usual protocols no longer functioned. He didn't know what came next, because he had never faced a kind of authority he couldn't control. Audrey looked at him, not with defiance, not with sarcasm, but with the gaze of someone who knew with precision. Every abuse of power, even if just for a moment, must be recorded, examined, and paid for. And that record had just begun. A cold wave swept through the courtroom, as if someone had flung open a door to a walk-in freezer. The FBI badge still rested in Audrey Rowe's hand, reflecting light straight into the eyes of those who tried to pretend they hadn't seen it. But they had. Everyone had. And none of them could turn their backs on what had just happened. Corbin, the young officer stationed near the main entrance, swallowed hard as he glanced at the monitor on the control desk. Camera 04, the wide-angle feed, was still recording every second. The red dot blinked like a mechanical heartbeat that somehow knew to tremble. Corbin's hand froze as he reached for the pause button. He didn't dare press it. Not because the law prohibited it, but because instinct screamed any interference now could end his entire career. Some people in the courtroom began retreating into their professional shells. Lawyers flipped through pages rapidly, their eyes no longer focused. A clerk clicked their pen non-stop, as if to drown out the pounding in their chest. A transcriptionist opened a Word file but kept typing typos. No one stood. No one tried to stop Bernie. But everyone was silently trying not to become a part of it. A young woman, an intern from a local law firm, quietly placed her phone under the desk and pressed the record button. She wasn't sure why. She had never seen a situation like this before. But a powerful gut feeling whispered, "If you don't record this, one day, it might be you they question." At the center of the shockwave, Audrey remained motionless. She didn't pull her hand back, didn't shift her footing, didn't adjust her posture. One hand held the badge. The other lay still beneath Bernie's, where a red imprint now stood out like a whip mark. But she showed no emotion, no groan, no sign of pain. She stood like a bronze statue in the middle of a battlefield, unshaken, needing no protection. Bernie, who once believed that maintaining order meant controlling everyone in the room, was now realizing the opposite. He was the one being controlled. He looked down at her wrist, where his thumb still subconsciously pressed, and suddenly noticed the red mark had darkened, like a stain of ink on a whiteboard, permanent and unerasable. His gaze wavered. His grip hadn't released yet, but the force had lessened. What held on now wasn't authority, it was confusion. Every ounce of arrogance, every habitual dominance Bernie had carried like armor, was now peeling off piece by piece before Audrey's unshakable composure. She didn't need to announce who she was. She didn't need to read her rights. She didn't need to state her authority or her role. The name Audrey Rowe, embossed on that badge, had already said everything. No one in the courtroom asked another question. No one dared speak, because they all understood. When a senior investigator from the FBI's Internal Oversight Division appears at a local court hearing, nothing about it is random. From a nameless woman, Audrey had, in a matter of moments, brought down the courtroom's order, silently but forcefully. A complete reversal of the power dynamic, not through shouting, not through force, but with the simple motion of opening a wallet. A man who believed he was the guardian of the courtroom was now gripping the wrist of the one who oversees the guardians. And he had no idea how to proceed. No one needed to hear her state her title. She had already shown she held authority, not through argument, but through presence. And the most terrifying thing for those used to wielding power to oppress others is when the black woman they dismissed turns out to be the one watching every mistake they make, and who has the power to write their name in the final report. No one in the courtroom was breathing evenly anymore. The FBI badge had already said too much, yet Audrey Rowe had not truly begun. And then, when she spoke for the first time since entering the courtroom, her voice carried not the tone of threat, but of finality. "Shut down all recording equipment immediately," she said. Slow, clear, and calm, to the point that every surrounding sound seemed strangled by its weight. A court supervisor turned to the court clerk, as if seeking confirmation. But the clerk Ark, silver-haired woman who had served 32 years in the judicial system, didn't hesitate. She quietly bowed her head, pulled out a red pen, marked the transcript, and nodded. "Execute under federal oversight authority," she murmured. Audrey didn't wait for consensus. She opened her leather case and took out a 6-page document sealed in red, with a bold title: Civil Hearing Suspension Order, Internal Oversight Code 7C/19. She walked straight to the central bench and placed the order in front of the presiding judge, a white man named Halcomb, known for his strictness and for consistently defending law enforcement personnel in the district. He started to speak, but halted after glancing at the first line. The embossed seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the signature of the National Director of Internal Misconduct Oversight dried the words on his lips. "This is a valid order," he admitted, unable to raise his head. The entire room's atmosphere shifted instantly. Audrey turned to the tech unit, demanding immediate retrieval of all civil case data involving officers Burney and Corbin over the past 18 months. A young legal assistant with braided hair, her hands trembling, opened her laptop and typed into the county's digital record system. She had never encountered anything like this, but followed the directive without question. The results appeared on screen within 45 seconds. Audrey didn't need anyone to report it. She walked over herself, leaned in, and then read aloud, slowly, precisely, each figure slicing through the courtroom's false sense of order like a blade. 47 civil trials involving Officer Burney. Of those, 60% ended with defendant removed from court, with no accompanying video footage. She paused. 78% had no witness statements documenting the circumstances leading to forced removal. A murmur rose from the back rows. Corbin, who once stood tall like a pillar of courtroom security, now took a subtle step backward. His hand gripped the table's edge, his face pale, his eyes fixed to the floor like a student caught cheating on an exam. Audrey wasn't finished. She pointed to the screen. "Pull the list of trials concluded within just 5 days," she ordered. The young assistant typed again, and results appeared swiftly. Audrey glanced and continued reading. 23 cases in 18 months. All included the phrase, "failure to comply with orders," with no specific justification. She stepped back to let the screen display fully. The entire room stared at the string of data, believing their own eyes. And no one could deny it any longer. This was no longer an ordinary civil trial. This was a forensic audit of power, through law, through evidence, and through irrefutable numbers. Burney, the man who once controlled every gaze in the room, opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words emerged. It was as though he'd just realized this was no longer his arena. The roars that once forced heads to bow had turned into an oppressive silence with no exit. When the courtroom doors closed following the official suspension, no one left, as if it were the end of a routine day. Every step was cautious, every gaze averted. But for Audrey, this was only the beginning of an investigation she knew would not end within the 4 walls of the county court. The next morning, at her temporary office inside the district's internal oversight unit, a beige envelope with no return address lay neatly on her desk. No one confirmed its delivery. No postmark, no stamp. It had simply appeared, like it knew the right moment to be found. Audrey used a letter opener to slit the edge. Inside were only 2 items, a brief typed letter and a color photograph. The letter contained just 2 lines. "I witnessed, and I turned away. This is the moment I can't stay silent any longer." The photo made Audrey's hand stop cold. In the picture was a closed courtroom. No gallery benches, none of the usual ceiling lights of civil trial rooms. She recognized the space, a room once used for internal hearings, about 6 years ago, since decommissioned. But the focus wasn't the room. It was the people. Burney, looking younger, but with the same gaze, the same posture, was holding down a black woman in a gray dress, pinning her to a table with unmistakable force. What startled Audrey most, on the woman's chest was a familiar silver badge, identical to the one she carried, a federal agent. The photograph did not appear in any report. It did not exist in any disciplinary file, administrative archive, or even internal documentation within the past 6 years. Audrey accessed the federal security system and requested retrieval of surveillance footage from the closed courtroom on the date listed in the image's metadata, April 18, 2019. The result returned. No record. Not just missing data. There was no backup, no system log, no trace. She knew this wasn't an accident. It was a total erasure pattern, an operation requiring system-wide coordination executed only by someone with at least Supervisor B clearance within the interagency oversight system. Wasting no time, Audrey forwarded the image to the Federal Identity Verification Division and ran a facial recognition search on the victim. Less than 90 minutes later, the report came back. The face matched Mirel Yvonne, a former agent of the Federal Department of Transportation, once assigned to an airport security oversight project in the Northeast region. Her file had been marked, "Investigation discontinued due to internal reasons," as of May 2019, just weeks after the date the photo was taken. The incident had never gone to trial. No reports, no medical records. Mirel had resigned shortly after and disappeared entirely from agency contact. Audrey didn't attempt to trace the letter's sender. She knew. The author didn't want to be found. They wanted the truth to surface. The bigger question was, who allowed this to happen without anyone asking why? She accessed Level B clearance, which permitted her to audit personnel records and internal approval processes for courtroom usage during the period in question. After 3 hours of searching, she stopped at a single authorization line. The one person who had signed off on using the closed courtroom that day, the district's judicial zone commander, Bernie's direct superior at the time. The case was beginning to take shape. This was no longer a case of isolated misconduct. It was a structure, a chain protected by silence, by authority, and by fear. And Audrey, the woman who had once shifted the balance in a courtroom with a single badge, now held something even more powerful. Evidence the system had once tried to erase. In the basement of the internal security wing on the east side of the federal judicial headquarters, where aging servers still blinked green lights in a chill, sterile silence, Audrey Rowe sat alone. The screen in front of her displayed lines of encrypted code, outdated and riddled with errors, yet no less dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. With a -3 level access, she had just been granted clearance by the Federal Data Security Bureau to unlock a subsidiary archive that had been encrypted for 6 years. These were files once believed to be lost or rendered inactive. But Audrey knew nothing ever truly disappears in the federal system unless someone wants it to. While querying, she discovered 4 personnel who had editing and deletion privileges over internal case data between 2018 and 2020. Notably, all 4 had been internally reassigned during 2020, the same quarter of 2020, not removed from the system, but relocated to departments with no further access to data, such as personnel records, off-budget finance, or physical document archives. She phoned the old administration office to verify details. As she stepped out of the meeting room, an older woman, small in frame but with eyes that held nothing soft, approached her. The woman did not offer her name, only said in a quiet voice, "I was once asked to delete a witness's name. The case involved a closed courtroom. At the time, I didn't know who she was. Just another colored name on a list." Audrey looked up. In over 15 years of investigating power abuse, this was the first time she had heard a confession from within the system. Not anonymous, not through legal counsel, but from a real person standing in front of her. The woman handed her an auxiliary security card, access to a temporary server known as Delta Layer, which stored raw entries before they were cleaned for official reports. Most staff didn't even know it existed, only certain managerial levels. The data here hadn't been filtered, altered, or redacted. Upon logging in, it took Audrey only 8 minutes to uncover 17 original records that did not match any content released in the official system. The videos, audio files, and raw transcripts revealed acts of coercion, threats, and inappropriate use of force by a group of officers, chief among them, Bernie and Corbin, targeting people of color, primarily women. She read each line carefully as she scanned the records. An elementary school teacher was dragged off the witness stand for uncooperative attitude, despite following instructions. A law student was blocked from exiting the courtroom and shoved to the floor after asking, "Am I allowed to remain silent?" A mother of 3 was forcibly removed simply because she brought her children, having no babysitter. None of them had any prior criminal history. Most never filed complaints. Some disappeared entirely, changed states, changed names, and lived as if they'd never existed inside a so-called justice process. Audrey immediately drafted orders to reopen investigations into the 13 most severe cases. With backing from the Office of Federal Oversight and the Department of Justice's supervisory authority, the orders were verified in less than 6 hours. No intermediaries, no waiting on local court approval. Each file was sealed, packaged, and sent directly to the National Investigative Council, an entity authorized to suspend any personnel listed in the documents. When the screen finally displayed the line, "Submitted, secure line," Audrey took a deep breath. She knew. This strike didn't just punch a hole, it opened a door into a system believed to be impenetrable. And now, the question was no longer who was wrong, but rather, who would try to close that door before it's too late? The hallway of the 3rd-floor legal wing was as quiet as usual. But that day, as Audrey exited the internal meeting room after an emergency session with the Federal Office of Justice Oversight, she saw someone waiting at the end of the corridor. A young man, neatly dressed, his face tense, eyes fixed on the gray tile floor. He wasn't security, nor was he federal staff. He was a district attorney, Jonas Lynn, only 32, recently appointed as an assistant prosecutor within the last 2 years. He walked toward her, hesitated, then stopped just 3 steps away. I was the one who recorded the footage of you being forcibly removed from your seat by Bernie during the hearing, Jonas said, his voice trembling, eyes still avoiding hers. I deleted it. Not because I hated you, but because I was afraid of losing everything. Audrey wasn't surprised. Silence always had its reasons. She had seen many kinds of fear, and this was the most honest kind, the fear that comes from knowing too well what you're living inside. She didn't scold, didn't guilt him. She simply looked at him, calm and steady. I don't need the clip. I need you to remember what to do next time. Jonas stood frozen, then slowly bowed his head. He didn't promise to take her side, didn't vow to expose anyone. But as he walked away, his steps were firmer, his shoulders straighter. A small change, but Audrey saw it. The system had begun to tremble from within. She returned to her office. On her left wrist, the bruise left by Bernie's grip still lingered, purple and swollen. A colleague passing by frowned when they saw it and asked, "Do you want to file an injury report? Assaulting a federal agent could lead to criminal charges." Audrey smiled faintly, not because of the pain, but because it was all too familiar. "I'm not here to count bruises. I'm here to count the people erased from the system." She rolled up her sleeve, opened her computer, and continued working as if nothing had happened. In the batch of internal records, she continued pulling from the auxiliary server. There was a short exchange between 2 former officers who had served at the district courthouse. "Handle it quickly. I'll take care of the paperwork later." A throwaway comment, buried in a hidden chat among technical logs. But for Audrey, it was a key. Because it confirmed what she suspected. Enabling misconduct didn't stop with the actors. It extended to those who quietly cleaned up behind the scenes. She extracted the chat, verified the login ID from the internal network, traced the IP address, and discovered that the recipient was a staff member formerly assigned to the Evidence Review Office. This person had since transferred to managing personnel files in 2021 and was no longer under internal oversight. But that didn't stop Audrey. She filed an emergency motion to reopen personnel access logs from the past 3 years, specifically targeting individuals who had editing rights over non-public records. Among dozens of profiles, she narrowed down 3 individuals who routinely signed off on the non-existence of evidence that should have been present, and all 3 had worked under Bernie's former commanding officer. The truth began to take shape. This was no longer a chain of individual errors. This was a structure, a deliberately crafted power mechanism where people became cogs, and silence was the currency used to buy survival within the system. But not everyone could stay silent forever. One young man had chosen to speak up, even with just a single confession. One former employee had chosen to hand over the key to the system, and Audrey, still standing at the center of the storm, was now threading it all together. That afternoon, under the pale fluorescence of the Special Operations Room, Audrey Rowe opened her laptop equipped with an independent encryption chip. Her fingers danced across the keyboard like plucking strings in a symphony, each keystroke a crescendo, each file a note echoing softly from the past. She organized all the evidence she had gathered into 6 main appendices. Each appendix was encrypted, electronically authenticated, and compressed under federal top-secret protocol. Level 4. A. List of victims. 47 individuals, the majority being women of color, aged between 19 and 52. Of those, 26 had never been mentioned in any official report. Time and location of coercive incidents, 71 court sessions across 16 legal facilities, spanning from March 2018 to September 2023. Omitted testimonies. 31 recovered audio recordings capturing questions that were never transcribed in court minutes. Unsubmitted video evidence. 14 internal clips, either recorded by staff or retrieved from auxiliary camera systems, never formally filed. Internal chat logs. The phrase, "I'll take care of the paperwork later," appeared at least 5 times in conversations between law enforcement and verification personnel. Anonymous letters and original photos. 3 unpublished images accompanied by a note, "We've been silent long enough." All documents were sent through the Federal Coordination System, where sensitive files are funneled directly to the National Investigative Council and the Office for Oversight of Public Authority. Audrey tagged the priority level as X-Red, investigation into organized abuse of power with suspected internal cover-ups. Just 58 minutes later, the first summonses were issued. 17 personnel from various agencies, those who had either approved or ignored questionable acts of coercion, were ordered to report. Among them were 4 local chief inspectors, 2 former staff from the Evidence Review Unit, and 1 former commanding officer of Bernie. Bernie received his suspension notice while filing a report at the police department. The police chief simply said, "Violation code 84-D, exceeded authority. You may not return." Corbin, though not physically involved, was also suspended for failure to act in the face of evident abuse of power. He left the precinct in silence, his access badge deactivated the moment he stepped away from his desk. Both of their files were locked, marked with a bold red label, "Access restricted," under National Investigation for Abuse of Authority. All related personnel were barred from accessing any internal documents, including emails, shift logs, or assignment histories. All communication devices were confiscated. What had once been part of their daily routine, entry to courthouses, independent investigations, access to witnesses, was now entirely frozen. In a modest office, surrounded by stacks of files under review, Audrey made no declarations of victory. She didn't need to. She simply turned to another monitor and began restoring a new data set. Courtroom activity in Harris County since 2017. Each mouse click, each decrypted file, was a fresh incision into a system that had long buried its misconduct beneath paperwork and silence. And for the first time in years, Audrey was no longer alone. A network of federal agents, conscientious prosecutors, and even former silent observers had begun to respond. The press didn't know. The public hadn't seen it. But deep within the system, a chain reaction had begun. On October 19th at 8:03 a.m., the internal communication system of the U.S. Department of Justice simultaneously issued an emergency alert. Expanded federal investigation at X-Red level, code 0910-FR-AUD-LAW, officially initiated in 13 counties across the state of Georgia. 3 minutes later, local law enforcement file seal orders were overridden by Federal Command Code 3B7FRC. Audrey Rowe entered the Eastern Region Federal Coordination Center located in Atlanta, where she would directly oversee the first phase of the investigation. Dressed in a black suit, she wore an agent badge embossed with ID number 000718 FBI and carried a file stamped in red. Confidential. Top secret. To be opened by supervising agent only. The first meeting took place in the B5 secure room, 3 floors underground, with the attendance of 8 federal representatives, 2 from the FBI's Internal Affairs Division, 1 from the Office for Civil Rights Violations Oversight, 1 federal prosecutor from the Department of Justice, and 4 digital agents tasked with recovering deleted data. Audrey presented, "We are no longer dealing with an individual or an administrative oversight. What I've uncovered is just the surface. Beneath that lies a structure that's been operating consistently for at least 6 years and 8 months, spanning a minimum of 31 courtrooms across 3 states. In Georgia alone, in 2022, there were 119 temporary coercion incidents, with no recorded video or official reports. 81% of the victims were people of color." One agent asked, "So what's our next objective?" Audrey didn't hesitate. "Trace the source. We're not looking for who made the mistakes. We're looking for who allowed them to exist." Within 72 hours of releasing the case files, the first 4 arrest warrants were signed. The former state courthouse security commander, charges, obstruction of justice and falsifying federal documents. A data administrator at the Fulton County Courthouse, charges, deleting investigative system access logs. A prosecutor who closed 14 coercion cases without filing witness records, charges, dereliction of duty, causing serious consequences. And Bernie Davis, the officer who had forcibly removed Audrey in court, faced 3 charges: abuse of power, unlawful use of force against a federal employee, and violating ethical provisions in the execution of duty. Finally, something had begun to change. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like button and subscribing. Don't forget to turn on notifications to start your day with powerful lessons and heartfelt empathy.